Luke Vargas is joining us. He's the United Nations correspondent for Talk Radio News Service. He has been all over everything going on at the UN, really for the last couple of weeks up in Midtown, which has caused all sorts of traffic craziness getting back into New York City. But my personal complaints aside, Luke, I want to talk about Syria first. Syria has been talked about a lot over the last few weeks and really kind of almost months at this point. And there was so much media interest when there was the possibility of American military action in Syria. Once that was no longer as likely, interest faded quickly, although there is still a really big story out of Syria. It's just not the type of international story that American corporate media seem to care about.
Sure. Everyone is talking about the OPCW inspectors arriving in Syria today. Everyone's talking about, well, I guess I'm glad they're talking about the UN. They're talking about the Security Council resolution on handing over the chemical weapons. But what I think is most amazing was something that was buried in the speech by the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of Syria yesterday at the United Nations. In this speech, he makes a reference to the refugees of the Syrian crisis, which, according to the latest estimates from the UN, number over 2 million people. He said in his speech that many of them are housed in military training camps and places that resemble detention centers. Then he went on to appeal, quote, to citizens of Syria to return to their towns and villages where the state guarantees their safe return and their livelihood away from the inhuman conditions they suffer in those camps. And it does not take an expert to make the determination that that's probably a promise that the Assad government cannot fulfill, that there is very little capacity for either the Assad government or the UN or any other humanitarian actors to take on a greater load of refugees or internally displaced persons within Syria at this time.
Right, and this really shows, you know, when the initial Syria military action conversation was starting, from all angles we were hearing the impetus for this, the catalyst, is because of the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Syria. Whenever I hear that as the reason for military action, to me red flags go up, because there are many opportunities to get involved in what are humanitarian crises, and we seem not to do that unless there is more of an interest. Immediately here, we have the elimination of the chance of military action, but the humanitarian crisis, as you're talking about, has not gone away at all. In fact, we're now getting these absurd and completely unbelievable statements. Why aren't we still talking about Syria? The humanitarian crisis is still there.
With luck, the conversation will turn towards the humanitarian part of the Syrian crisis again. The Security Council this week is debating a possible resolution or statement that would call on the Assad government to create humanitarian hubs within the country, allow for border crossings of humanitarian convoys into the country, but it would take hundreds, if not thousands, of those caravans of humanitarian aid to really tip the scales in the humanitarian crisis. And again, to have a comment urging people to return to the country now. I just spoke to the head of the Syrian support group in D.C. just moments before coming on here. He said northern Syria looks like Kandahar, and that the rest of Syria's population centers are still under shelling from the regime. For them to return back, the gentleman I spoke to said, it seems only like a recruiting tactic, trying to get more people to come back in the country, perhaps to be recruited to fight on the side of the Assad government against increasingly intense rebel factions that are fighting them. But it seems a little bit like cynical comments from the Syrian foreign minister yesterday at the UN.
And speaking of humanitarian crises and media coverage of international events, I want to talk a little bit about Sudan. Now, I am often critical of the fact that Americans seem to be not particularly informed about what is going on outside the U.S., and even often within the U.S., the information can be limited. And here we have an example where in Sudan, there is actually an opportunity to discuss very important things that are happening and to inform the public. However, American media seem obsessed with one particular story about Sudan. Tell us what's being discussed and then what is going on behind the scenes that we're not really hearing much about.
In all fairness, the story that the media is discussing related to President Bashir of Sudan is actually quite interesting. It involves allegations by Sudan that they denied an entry visa for the president to travel to the General Assembly. There are charters between the United States and the United Nations that say the U.S. is supposed to let anyone who's coming to speak on official business at the UN come here. The Sudanese foreign minister, speaking on Friday, said the U.S. turned down that request, but the media has continued to talk about this story, in spite of the fact that the foreign minister spoke yesterday with John Kerry in Washington. And there is a lot more going on in Sudan that expands beyond this issue of the visa.
That's right. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? I mean, we have popular protests, we have a referendum that's pending, and these are things which are just not really making it to the very few minutes that even exist on most American newscasts to discuss what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll hit the main points of what's going on in Sudan now. There were recently some longstanding subsidies on fuel in the country were cut last week, sending thousands of people into the streets, not only in the capital of Khartoum, but around the country. 5,000 to 10,000 are the number of protesters I'm hearing from Khartoum. There are reports of high-ranking officials in the country leaving, sending their families outside of Sudan. There's a petition signed by many of them calling for the restoration of the fuel subsidies. And the internet was also shut down for 24 hours last week as there were reports circulating that the president had hired militias to shoot at peaceful protesters and thus convince people not to go out into the streets. Newspapers are being closed, and the coverage we're getting from Sudan, if there's much coverage at all, is only coming from experts who call into us, big television networks. They're calling in from the Middle East and in Europe. So not a lot coming out of Sudan right now at a time where there could be, I guess, a coup of sorts about to happen, a big movement away from the president, Bashir, as the International Criminal Court wants him held accountable for 10 counts of war crimes in the Sudan conflict of a few years ago.
No question at all that there are big stories there that are just not reaching most ears and eyes of the average news consumer. We've been speaking with Luke Vargas, United Nations correspondent for Talk Radio News Service. I know you've got to get back. I know Netanyahu is speaking now, so we'll talk to you next time, Luke. Thanks as always.
Thanks, David. Cheers.